Guardian correspondent Rory Carroll has survived kidnapping in Iraq and risked his life, reporting from war zones all over the world. Now his career has come full circle and he's covering his home turf in Ireland. In his new book, Killing Thatcher, he tells the story of the infamous Brighton bomb that came close to killing the Iron Lady. What an interesting subject to write about. Now, you and I have just been having a chat, but do you want to just explain in your own words why it is that you chose this subject?
I stumbled into it as part of my day job for The Guardian. I'm always looking for stories about Ireland, Northern Ireland. And a few years ago, the man convicted of the bombing, Patrick McGee, did a memoir. And I interviewed him about the memoir. Now, it was fascinating about why he joined the IRA, his childhood, but it veiled the actual Brighton operation, to use IRA terminology. But it did get me researching the topic. And initially I assumed, well, we all know what happened. It's a familiar story, right? But actually it was anything but. I mean, once I started getting into the research of, how the IRA, why they went after Thatcher, how they did the plot, and how they came so close to killing her, and then the police hunt for the bombers. I mean, it's an extraordinary story, and it had been largely untold. So, I just dived into this as a story because I just feel like in Britain, the page turned very quickly on what was an epochal event.
Yeah. So how close did they come to killing Thatcher?
Extremely close. And I think a lot of people forget this because it was a time bomb that was planted in the Grand Hotel 3 weeks before the Tory party conference in 1984. And it went off at just before 3 o'clock in the morning, and it obliterated adjacent rooms. But really, the kind of the devilish inspiration of the bomb was to turn the hotel itself into the weapon, because the force of the explosion went upwards. It shattered the roof, and thereby it toppled a 5-ton chunk of a chimney stack, which then tumbled down into the heart of the hotel. Now, the IRA...
And did they do that by design?
Yes, well, the IRA told me, one of the planners of the bombing, that they had sent a construction engineer in advance. They've been planning this for years. I mean, this was the single most audacious attack in the IRA's history. Wow. And they had planned it for years. They had surveilled successive Tory party conferences. They were lining up all their ducks in a row, and they had studied the architecture of the Grand. And so they had a pretty good idea that if this chimney stack, 5 tons of masonry, could then start slicing through the hotel like a homicidal guillotine, just taking out one floor after another. Now that was the weapon that was to kill Margaret Thatcher.
It kind of sounds almost like Twin Towerish, doesn't it? So it killed 5 people. I imagine they thought it would probably kill more. But Patrick McGee, he only served, 14 years as part of the Good Friday Agreement? Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And he had been sentenced to 35 years minimum, 8 life sentences. And the judge, really clearly hoped that he would kind of really never leave prison again. And yet, in one of the multiple ironies of this whole story, he was released under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement in 1999 after serving 14 years. And I say that's ironic because, in a way, Margaret Thatcher's survival, she then went on to sign the Anglo-Irish Agreement a year later, which in many ways paved the Good Friday Agreement, and which paved the release of the man who came so close to killing her. So, there's all these threads in the story that, of different lives, the way they intersected in different ways. And so really what I want to do in the book is thread them all together.
And she also, to Margaret Thatcher, she actually decided after the bomb, didn't she? It was 3 o'clock in the morning. She decided that conference would go on and continue. And despite the people who died and those who had just been completely disrupted, do you think she did the right thing? I mean, I can't imagine myself being in that situation. I've been the Grand, and the chaos and the disruption and the upheaval, but she was determined that the conference would continue.
Her response was extraordinary because, she was in a de facto war zone, and her composure was remarkable. Everybody commented upon it, the fire crews who escorted her out. And she, within an hour, when she was finally taken away from the hotel itself was still a crumbling, smoking ruin. She told the senior police and her own officials, the conference will go on. They were horrified. they had assumed that they wanted to shuttle
clear
her
it.
back to Downing Street as
Yeah.
fast as possible, do a sort of lockdown. And she said, no, I'm not leaving. And the conference is going ahead. And the convention centre was right beside the hotel. And so they couldn't believe it. And for her, it wasn't enough that she survived. For her, she wanted to show the IRA that they had failed even to disrupt the conference.
Yeah.
And that was, in many ways, and sure enough, the conference went ahead on time, and she gave a speech that afternoon, which was a bravura performance of defiance, of composure, albeit her audience was largely shell-shocked. But it was really, I think, it was her finest hour.
Can I ask you, was there, because, I grew up with the IRA bombings taking place. Part of my life was the daily disruption of a bomb warning. Was there a warning for the bomb, for that particular bomb?
Absolutely not, no. In this case...
That's unusual, because there was always a warning, wasn't there?
Well, it depended on the target and the circumstances. I mean, in this case, yes, they planted a bomb in a hotel filled with sleeping civilians, hundreds of people. But the target, from the IRA's point of view, was so precious. This is a one-off chance that they had to take out a sitting Prime Minister and hopefully, from their point of view, wipe out half the government.
Yeah.
And therefore, a warning would have sabotaged that. So even though, the IRA Army Council had thought about warning their own volunteers to say, hey, everybody lie low, we got, something big is about to happen, in anticipation of a huge British response, a security response, but they didn't. The reason being, the IRA was so infiltrated by informers, they didn't want to give any chance of the British security forces having a heads up.
Sure. So, one thing I found interesting, I first stood for election in 2001, and I did hear some Conservative activists talking about their own experience. They'd been at that conference, and Sir Keith Joseph, who they'd found, and I met two women who'd actually run a kind of room in the hotel throughout the night, serving people tea and what have you. But when I got to Westminster in 2005, that year there were a lot of the old guard left behind who'd been there. I've never heard, despite the fact that key members of the government did die, and Norman Tebbett's wife famously very injured, that never have I heard one single MP in my party in Westminster talk about it. And I find that extraordinary. Having just glanced through, I find it such a huge, enormous event to have taken part in the Conservative Party history that actually nobody talks about it.
I find that equally extraordinary. In some ways, it's to the credit of the government. But first, when we think about it, I mean, the last time something like this had happened was 1605. It was the gunpowder plot, Guy Fawkes.
Yeah.
That bomb didn't even go off.
No.
This bomb did go off, killed 5 people, and we saw it, on live TV. It was one of the first live TV events that we could see. We saw Norman Tebbit being dragged out in his pajamas. And it did, in some ways, change British history because, for example, Norman Tebbit was one of the designated heir, or many people considered that he would be the heir to Thatcher.
Yeah.
In a way, his own personal injuries and then those of his wife, he then quit frontline politics to care for his wife. I mean, Britain's politics and history changed right there.
Dramatically.
I mean, and one, I think, reason that things changed so quick, that the page turned so fast was that Margaret Thatcher took the lead on this. She didn't want to give the IRA the satisfaction, of seeing the British kind of dwelling on this. And so it was partly the stiff upper lip.
Yeah.
And that's creditable, but there is a sense that maybe the page just turned too fast. I mean, this was a 9/11 moment.
So, I was with Oliver Letwin. We did have a conference in the Grand Hotel in Brighton. I think it was in 2004. And I remember being on the staircase with Oliver Letwin, and he asked for a moment because he stood on the kind of like the mezzanine floor of the staircase as you went up, and he was looking up, and he said to me, the last time I was here, there was a huge hole in that ceiling. So I think it had an impact on people. But, in the true tradition of the Conservative Party, everyone just ploughed on and got on with, the business of governing and the business of being the Conservative Party. But it's interesting because also Patrick Magee's made friends with the daughter of Anthony Berry, who was our Deputy Chief Whip.
That's right.
Who lost his life. Mm-hmm. Now, that's a key figure in the Thatcher government. And Patrick Magee has struck up a friendly relationship with his daughter.
A remarkable friendship. After his release in 1999, she, the daughter Jo Berry, reached out to him. She wanted to meet him. I mean, her father's killer, because I think she was looking for, meaning in her father's murder, and to see if somehow she could find some good in it, or reconciliation, or something, in curiosity. And they struck up this remarkable bond, and they've appeared on stage together literally more than 100 times at conferences around the world, where the context is reconciliation, bridge building, and so forth. Yeah. And it is
forgiveness.
Remarkable. Yes, although it's in the case of McGee, he's sorry, not sorry. I think, and he's sincere, I think, in for the suffering that he inflicted. Yet he still defends the Brighton bomb and the IRA campaign as legitimate acts of war. So it's not a clear-cut sense of forgiveness. That's an interesting
perspective, which actually will make this book all the more interesting. Rory, having met you and spoken to you, I can sense how well-researched this book will be and how fascinating will it be. Can I give you a tip? Make sure it's for sale at the Conservative Party conference in October, because I think you'll do pretty well there. But I'm going to read this, and I'd recommend anybody else to read it, because I'm sure it will be a fascinating read, particularly for those of us who are interested in both the history of the Conservative Party, but of the governments of the day as well, and what they've had to endure, and also Mrs. Thatcher. So, Rory, it's been fantastic to meet you. Thank you very much for coming on and talking about this.